So again, just to nail a serious filmmaking point, one of the reasons why a sequel does get made is because of the pre-sales that it will get in international markets based on the success of the first film.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Absolutely. That's the only way this film would get made was because the first film appeared to be, was so commercially viable that those people said, well, we'll go again, And what's interestingly is that because people know so much about sequels these days, they don't expect this to do as well. So they will expect this to do a certain percentage, have a certain percentage less, but even factoring that in, it's still worth making. It's still actually a commercially viable endeavour.
Now, just to address a wider point about a phenomenon that I'm noticing about the growing disconnect between critical opinion and popularity of films. The difference between what critics say and how audiences respond. Now, as you probably know, the previous film, A Few Best Men, was absolutely slated by critics, and probably the cherry on top of those bad reviews was my review that declared the movie unreleasable. The film, of course, goes on to make about $2 million, I think, at the local box office, and as you've said, becomes internationally successful. What say you to this growing disconnect between audiences and critics?
Look, it's an interesting phenomenon, and it seems to be happening more and more, and I've watched it. I don't know about you, Jim, personally, but my feeling is with critics generally that there's so much competition these days with social media. Like, in literally everyone's a critic. You know what I mean? You're seeing it on Facebook. People have got blogs, all that kind of stuff. And I find with some critics that almost to stand out, they'll make larger, broader claims, or they'll take more polarized views of things because they need to be more interesting, to arrest attention in what is now, there's just so much stuff out there, so much opinion out there, as Donald Trump would point out to us, sort of alternative news, alternative facts. And I think it's a response to that, but that's coming from my side of the picture, and you may completely disagree with me. I'd be really interested to hear what you think, Jim. Like, why do you think there is that?
Well, I agree with you in terms of the impact of social media. Whatever is happening to Twitter, I know that it's in decline at the moment. They're trying to sell the company. They can't find a buyer. Nonetheless, I believe that platforms such as Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, of course, have amplified the effect of word of mouth, which, of course, as I think you'll agree, is the most important marketing asset any film can have, is good word of mouth. And what you used to have was just friends telling their circle of friends. Now one person can tell pretty much everybody who's online what they think of the film, and that amplifies the power of word of mouth.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. It's interesting just watching some of the threads on the movie that are on Facebook, and I watched one. There's one. The distributors, Studio Canal, are releasing little sort of snippets of the film, funny, little tiny trailerettes, if you like. And one of them had something like 35,000 views already, and I was like, God, that is amazing. 35,000 people have seen that one little thing about this movie, and that is completely new. Like 10 years ago, that simply wasn't available to you. So it is interesting, this word of mouth thing and the capacity. And in fact, the whole campaign around this movie is completely different. There's no traditional marketing, there's no television advertising, there's no radio advertising, there's no outdoor advertising. It's all what they call dark media. All of their money is into boosting Facebook posts, Facebook moments, Twitter, all of the social media stuff. So it's sort of a bold new world. It'll be interesting to see kind of where it leads us, really.
The other quick point that I would add is basically building on your point about the online world of film criticism. I think that the massive expansion of film criticism has led to an overall deterioration of the quality of film criticism. And I've got to say that as an old school trained film critic coming from a journalism background, I find that a lot of critics who have been trained through the online arena are by and large absolutely appalling writers And as you say, they do tend to exaggerate when they can in order to get audiences, but also they're just either really flaccid writers, and in a pool where there are so many critics, it's harder to take them seriously.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it's a pity because we do have in this country, of course, a tradition of very good criticism, and particularly very good film criticism. Like very considered and educated film criticism, and that appears to me to be dying off and being replaced by this slightly sensational, oh, I really hated that kind of thing, or oh, that's awesome, you've got to go and see it, without really much reflection or study or research into what the filmmakers have been doing or why they've been doing it. So that in the end, there's very little wisdom to offer the readers or an audience about what the film is about, and that's a big pity, and that's a big loss.
The general rule of thumb that I apply is that if a film critic overuses the first person, then you're in trouble. It's probably the sign of a weak writer.
Right, yeah, that's a good note, yeah.
Mark, what are your comedy influences? Who inspires you?
Oh, gosh, they're kind of very Catholic tastes, really. I worked for years with George Miller. For 15 years I was at Kennedy Miller in the very early days of my career and left after I did Babe Pig in the City. But George used to always say to me, you have to do Ealing comedies. You're born to do Ealing comedies. And that indeed is sort of where a lot of my influence comes from. I think I love those sorts of... I am more attracted to British humour than I am to American humour. Although I do enjoy all humour, really. But yeah, more British kind of thing, I'd say.
Right, that's very high praise from someone like George Miller, that you should be doing Ealing comedies. I love that.
Yeah.
And just quickly, with Goddess, how did Goddess end up doing?
It's done okay. I mean, it continues to kind of open around the world, funnily enough. So it sort of, it did disappointingly here. I think it was the highest grossing Australian film of the year, 2012 or whenever that was. And I think that wasn't saying much, kind of thing. I had higher hopes for it. I still reflect upon what I could have done there differently, because it was a musical, it was an original musical. I mean, it was a very bold idea to make a musical about a young mum stuck at home with kids. I had the original idea because I saw my co-writer putting on a one-woman show. She's a cabaret performer for a matinee audience of young mothers. And of course, The Goddess, just to run back a little bit, is a story of a young mum stuck at home with twin toddlers. She's going out of her mind, so she installs a webcam over the kitchen sink and starts singing songs to the universe in the hope that someone will hear her. And of course, somebody eventually does. She becomes famous, and then it's what do I do with my fame? So that's sort of the story of Goddess. And basically that story was there in this funny little one-woman show that Joe put on that I saw. And after the show, she was absolutely mobbed by young mums saying, oh my God, that's us. You have given us a voice. That is my experience. And I thought, watching them mobbing her, wow, that is an area of movies where it's just not serviced very much. You just don't see young mothers being sort of written for. And perhaps if I'd reflected on that a little bit further, I would have realised that, of course, young mothers don't really get to the cinema. Young mothers are stuck at home with their children. So it's done very well on television, and it always rates its head off when it plays on TV. But it was disappointing at the cinema, unfortunately.
Can I just also add that, having watched the film in preparation for this interview, I actually found that it unspooled a lot smoother in the home environment. And it must be heartening to you that films these days do have quite an afterlife thanks to streaming services.
Yeah, it is. It's great. That is one thing as a filmmaker that is fantastic. I mean, the downside about the internet is recently I found My Mother Frank, an old film I made sort of in 2000. They're being pirated, and there was something like 6 million downloads that had been pirated of that film.
Ouch!
And I just thought, holy hell, that's money that, would have gone into the producer's pocket and my pocket, that is just sort of completely unpoliceable. And so I am very glad now that there are formal places that these movies can be downloaded and used, and that we can see a lot for them and also see some money from them,
My Mother Frank you found available online, and 6 million views. That's got to be at least tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of value to you.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Yeah, it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars, I imagine, that would be lost
Gosh.
because of illegal streaming. Yeah.
I'm very keen to know what the experience was like co-writing Babe, Pig in the City, because that film, of course, was the sequel to Babe, which made about $400 million worldwide in adjusted dollars. Pig in the City was a lot softer. Can you tell me what the experience was like writing or co-writing that film?
Yeah, it was co-writing Babe, Pig in the City was such an interesting experience. It was me and George Miller and Judy Morris, and we quite literally sat at a desk every day, the three of us sort of lined up, and we'd sort of squabble over who would have the keyboard, and we'd just sit there sort of spitballing day after day until we worked kind of through the movie. I mean, we kind of worked out an overall structure first. We had, we spoke earlier in the interview about sort of having a diamond idea, something to inspire you. And I remember we worked very hard on that. I remember it up on the board in front of us. And the diamond idea was a kind and steady heart can mend a sorry world. And it sort of sat up there reminding us what this movie was about and what Babe was about for the entire time writing it. But it basically was just sort of the three of us kind of having fun, squabbling, coming back. You know, someday we were perfectly capable of spending an entire morning on a full stop, or whether that should be a full stop or a semicolon. But we just sort of moved through it that way. And then, of course, the film came out, and it didn't... Well, it was such a weird reception, really. You know, in the same year that it came out, I think the president of Universal said publicly that Babe, Pig in the City was the second worst film Universal had ever made. And that, as you can imagine, was really devastating. And then at the same time, you know, sort of revered critics like Roger Ebert came out and said that it was the best film of the year. So what I learned from that experience really was to let both of those things go by you know, and just when if you're making films, just to really commit to doing your best, whatever that is, and not be too obsessed about, you know, what everybody around you is thinking and saying, and just sort of get on with it, you know. Proceed with a kind and steady heart, you know. But I think it was after the film came out.
Right.
It was after the film came out and then it didn't have the kind of commercial success. I think it was a response, basically, to that he said it, yeah.
Now,
but yes, it was great. I mean, it's the thing, you know, people forget that it's just people making movies, you know. And I think it's interesting, I've noticed this, because I write novels too, you know, and I notice criticism with novels is a much kinder thing. I think there's this thing with movies where people forget, or people think, oh, it's hundreds of people making this film, and it sort of doesn't matter how brutal or nasty I am about it. Whereas that never happens with novels. People are much kinder with novels, and I think it's because it's just one person that they blame, just the author. It's always been my experience with that kind of side of things. Whereas with movies, I think people tend to forget that they're just people. And actually, when people say horrible things like that, you know, that means that sort of they're probably filmmakers sort of curled in a ball on their bed feeling sick, you know. It's not like it doesn't matter just because a whole lot of people made it. It's still kind of hurtful, and you've got to take that on board and, you know, not let it get you down and pick yourself up and dust yourself off and march on.
Now, just quickly, speaking of novels, you wrote a novel called The Full Ridiculous, which was a comedy drama telling the tale of a man who had been hit by a car, run over by a car, and about the post-traumatic experience that he has and how it affects his family. How did that book go, and are you going to make a movie?
The book's done very well. It's sort of been translated into a number of languages, and I'm not sure. I think it might be a play rather than a movie. A few people have talked to me about it. I'm not convinced about it being a movie. I'm also not particularly interested in making it myself. I feel like I've told that story, I've done that story, and I'd like to move on. I would like to see what other filmmakers would do with it. I'd like to, you know, pass the ball and see if somebody else did want to do that. But I'm not convinced it's a movie. I do have another book out quite recently, a thing called The Lovers Guide to Rome, which I'm just in the process of doing a very big film deal on, actually. And again, it was an American company. I can't quite talk about it yet because it's just happening now. But my only condition was with that book was that I have nothing to do with writing it or directing it. I said, you can have the rights, but don't ask me to do anything more with it. No, I think it's because I like to move on to new stuff. You know, I feel like if you look back at your work or you hold on to the stuff that you've done before, you tend to sort of block the passage for what's coming up ahead. You know, I think it's sort of looking the wrong way in a sense. I think it's why, for example, Stephen Elliott didn't direct his second movie. You know, he wanted to move on to new material. And I think that's sort of very important for you as an artist to do that, to move forward rather than look backward.
Mate, my final question. The Full Ridiculous is is about a man who gets run over by a car. You based the story on your experience getting run over by a car. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. Yeah.
Well, this might be the oddest way to end an interview, but can you tell me what it feels like to get hit by a car?
Do you know, I can remember every single detail. Time does slow when you're in a situation like that. My experience was I was crossing on a pedestrian crossing. I thought the driver had waved me across the crossing, but in fact what she was doing was she'd been blinded by the morning sun and she was grappling for her sun visor to bring it down. I didn't realise that. I then just didn't take any more notice of the car and sort of strode out across the crossing, and it was only just before she hit me that I thought, oh my God, she's not stopping. She hasn't seen me at all. In fact, she's just travelling at 60 kilometres an hour. And I remembered something sort of from 20 years previously, which was being on the set of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, and I did a making of Mad Max all those years ago, and talking to Grant Page, the stunt supervisor, and Grant saying to me saying, how do those guys how do they not get hurt when you run the cars into them? And he said the trick for being in a stunt is make sure you go over the car. If you can get yourself up and over the car, you're fine because you can roll off it. If you go under, you're knackered. You'll be absolutely knackered. And do you know, in that moment, in that millisecond before the car hit me, I remember Grant Page telling me that. And so I kind of got myself up on my toes as far as I could, and then the car kind of slammed into my thigh, and I sort of slid up the bonnet, smashed into the windscreen, and then sort of ricocheted off and landed about 15 metres down the road. It was because she was going quite fast. And I remember landing, and I couldn't feel my body, but I remember thinking, Grant Page would be proud of me. But yes, so that's my story. Yeah.